My name is Quinn, and I'm the current NASA president, and I'll be moderating the event today along with Lisa Budney, who will be moderating written questions. Before we begin, I just want to do a few housekeeping issues and get those out of the way. I'd first like to let folks know that everyone will be muted until the Q&A portion today at the end of the talk. And at that time, if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and we'll proceed with that question. Or you can click on the link provided, which will be put into the chat, I believe right now, if somebody could throw that into the chat. And we will take written questions from you. So if you are thinking of questions as the talk goes on, you can submit those. And at the end, Lisa will be presenting those to Mr. Acuña. So I just want to also state that let's try to keep, we don't have much time, so let's try to keep the questions on topic around pensions as much as possible. I know that there'll probably be some leeway into tangential or related topics, but we want to try to address the Alberta Pension Plan as much as we possibly can, and we'll try to restrict questions of that nature. I also want to take this chance to tell you about some upcoming events and ongoing campaigns. First, I'd like to let you know that the Alberta Federation of Labour and Public Interest Alberta, which are two of our partner groups, are running campaigns regarding the Alberta Pension Plan proposal. We're going to drop some links into the chat for those of you who might be interested. I would suggest that you check those out and lend support where you can. We also have the Executive Director of Friends of Medicare, Chris Galloway, coming for a luncheon hour session next week. That's on Tuesday, October 24th from noon to 1. We're going to be talking about why Alberta needs pharmacare and why it's good for the membership. That'll be at the Cascade Room in the Students' Union building, but it is also a hybrid event. So if you prefer to be online, you can jump in online as well. Registration is not required, and you can look for information on that in the Buzz or in our social media. The last but not least, I want to let people know that Parkland Institute is having its 27th annual conference, and that's from November 17th to 19th. It's titled Alberta at the Crossroads, Building the World We Want. There's a great lineup of speakers like Abby Lewis, Angela McEwen, Laura McMurphy, Ahmed Ali, Carissa Halton, just tons of people. I won't get to all of them here, but I would just ask that you look at the link in the chat as well, check out the speakers, and hopefully you'll be able to attend. I'll make sure that I'm there, and I'd love to see some of our members attend as they're able. So just to start off, I want to let people know that we always start with the land acknowledgement, so I'm going to jump right into that, and then we'll get into introductions. NASA respectfully acknowledges that we are located on traditional lands known as Treaties 6 and 7 territory, home to many First Nations, Métis, and other Indigenous peoples. Decolonization, racial equity, and a diverse, inclusive, accessible workplace for all members are fundamental NASA values that guide us in our everyday work and decisions we make. We encourage members to reflect on their own relationship and responsibility to this land, and we will continue to be an active partner with these and other Indigenous allies across Turtle Island, so long as we are welcome. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to now take this time to introduce Ricardo Acuña. He is the director at Parkland Institute, which is a research center located right here on the University of Alberta campus, for those who don't know, and has been at the forefront of policy analysis and research in Alberta for a few decades now. Mr. Acuña has 35 years experience in organizational leadership, governance, communications, and advocacy, with specific experience researching and commenting on politics and public policy, especially here in Alberta. He's a strong advocate of the public interest and has long been committed to making a positive contribution to public dialogue, democracy, and engagement. So today we're here to listen to Mr. Acuña's insights on a specific matter of great significance to the membership and for pensioners across the country, and that's the Alberta government's proposal to transition Albertans from the Canada Pension Plan to the Alberta-based pension plan. Recently, Mr. Acuña released an article relating this topic, and I believe it's called Selling Fiction as Fact, Alberta Pension Plan Report Built on Invented Numbers and False Premises. That link is also going to be put into the chat, so I'd encourage folks to have a look at that and read if you'd like some more background information. And this idea has captured the attention and concern of many across the country, including NASA, and we'd like to welcome Ricardo to lend us his perspective and expertise on this important issue. So with that, Ricardo, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you so much, Quinn. It really is great to be here. It's been a while since I've been invited to do one of these noon hour talks with NASA. It's always a treat. The last time I did one, we were in person. This one's a little different, but I'm still looking forward to the conversation and the questions. I imagine, as this is fairly fresh in people's minds, that there are going to be a lot of questions. So I will try to keep my comments to like 20 minutes maximum, so that we can dive a little deeper into the issues that you're actually concerned about or that are actually mattering to you. Where I want to start today is actually talking about the Canada Pension Plan, not kind of the proposal for the Alberta one, but the Canada one, just to kind of do a quick overview of what it is, what we're being asked to leave behind. And many of you may know most of this already, but it's always worth going through it as a refresher. The Canada Pension Plan was established in 1965 through an act of Parliament. And the idea was to provide Canadian workers with a guaranteed flow of income into retirement. An earnings-based defined benefit plan is kind of how it's structured. The idea is that every worker over the age of 18 is required to participate in the CPP and is then entitled to receive benefits from the CPP upon retirement. As we all know, contributions to the plan are split 50-50 between workers and employers, or paid 100% in the case of self-employment by the employee. And they're calculated as a percentage of your annual income. So currently it's 5.95% of your income paid by employees and employers, or if you're self-employed, it's 11.9% of your income. And there's a maximum on that. So for 2023, the maximum pensionable earning amount is $66,600. So that is what CPP covers, and that is what CPP is calculated on, which makes for a maximum contribution of $3,754.45. So that's what somebody who's earning above the maximum will contribute to CPP every year, $3,754. Or if you're self-employed, it would be $7,508.90. And the idea here is for the benefits. When they designed it, the goal was to have the benefits provide approximately 25% of a retiree's average lifetime earnings. Of course, those are adjusted for the annual maximums, and they're designed to drop some low income periods from the average. But yeah, so the goal was to make that 25% originally. In 2019, it was agreed that the benefit should be improved and that it would be improved over time so that it would eventually reach 33% of average lifetime earnings. So about a third of your average income over your lifetime is what the CPP will eventually be meant to cover. The actual benefits are fairly decent. This year in 2023, the maximum CPP benefit at age 65 is $1,306.57 per month. So if you were to retire this year and you qualified for the maximum benefit, you'd get just over $1,300 a month from your CPP. And the average monthly benefits, so this is the average benefit paid out in June of this year, was $772. That's across the country. On average, a new retiree in June was receiving $772 a month. And one of the beauties of the CPP, one of the things that makes it such a good plan and so well regarded, is that the benefits are fully indexed to inflation. So as inflation goes up, the benefits go up by inflation every year, and they really retain their value. In 1956, when the plan was being hashed out, Quebec opted not to join the CPP and set up their own plan, the Quebec Pension Plan, instead. The reason they chose to do this was because at the time, Quebec had a younger population, so many more people paying into the plan, fewer people drawing from the plan. So they felt that they could set up a similar plan for cheaper contribution rates. But they also had a strong desire to build up a pension fund of their own. that they could use to support province building and distinct francophone programs. In other words, to invest money back into Quebec, so have some control over what they were investing. We can cover how some of that turned out for them near the end of the presentation. So Quebec set up a plan designed on the same premise as the CPP, with all contributions and benefits being fully portable across the country, which means if you paid into the QPP and for some reason decide to retire in Edmonton, then your payments, your benefits are the same as somebody who was paid into the CPP and retired in Edmonton, and vice versa. Because of Quebec's decision not to join, and because it's actually the provincial governments that have jurisdiction over pensions in the country, the CPP Act was designed from the start to include provisions to enable provinces to leave the plan. And the only proviso is that benefits had to be consistent from province to province or from province to CPP, and portable from province to province, meaning you could move them and earn them anywhere you worked or retired in the country. Initially, the plan was set up as a pay-as-you-go plan, which meant that the benefits in any given year were paid directly from the contributions that came in that year. So in any year, money in from contributions, money out from benefits, and the goal was to balance those. Became clear very quickly, however, that pay-as-you-go would get into some trouble in terms of sustainability once the baby boomers approached retirement age, as much more money would be needed to come out when the peak of the baby boom started retiring, and that would make the increase in contributions and premiums at the time much higher. So the plan was adjusted at that time to increase contributions and reduce benefits, and the idea being over the long term to create a pool of money that could be invested in order to help provide benefits for the growing number of retirees. This is when the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board was created as an arm's length body. So it's not a Crown corporation, it's a separate entity from government to make the investment decisions without the possibility of government influence or interference in those investment decisions. Those changes in 1997 worked quite effectively. Today, the CPP fund has assets over $500 billion. That's $500 billion. In the latest actuarial report, which looks at the assets, the contribution rates, the future benefit payments, shows that the plan as of now and at current contribution rates is actuarially sound for at least the next 75 years. So the plan is stable. If we maintain the benefits, if we maintain indexing as it is right now, barring any huge international financial disasters, we've got a plan right now with $500 billion in assets, and that is stable for the next 75 years. It's actually currently one of the most stable and successful benefit plans of this nature in the world. So that's the CPP. This whole discussion in Alberta has a bit of a trajectory, this whole discussion around the CPP and wanting to leave it. One of the first mentions of the idea of an Alberta pension plan was by a political party called the Western Canada Concept Party, which was a fairly radical Western separatist party that believed that the Western provinces should separate from the rest of Canada. And this was in the 1982 provincial election. So it's always been a topic of conversation. Albertans have always loved to beat up on the federal government and federal programs, and this was just one more issue with which they could do that. The idea actually gained more prominence in mainstream circles after Stephen Harper, Tom Flanagan, Ted Morton, a group of what's been called the Calgary School, wrote a letter to Premier Ralph Klein in 2001, a letter that since comes to be known as the Firewall Letter, which called for, and this is a quote, Albertans to take greater charge of our own future. The idea was that they would do this by moving on such policies as setting up our own income tax agency, establishing a provincial police force to replace the RCMP, and getting rid of equalization. Specifically, on the question of the pension fund, the letter called for Alberta to, and this is a quote again, withdraw from the Canada Pension Plan to create an Alberta Pension Plan offering the same benefits at lower cost while giving Alberta control over the investment fund. If Quebec can do it, said the authors, why not Alberta? So this was the firewall letter in 2001, and it really is the birth of the discussion we're having today around the Alberta Pension Plan. Ralph Klein at the time rejected most of these ideas outright. But as Harper, Morton, and their ideas gained prominence in the party and greatly influenced and informed the future campaigns of people like Danielle Smith, twice now, and Jason Kenney. These two in particular repeatedly doubled down on picking fights with Ottawa and insisting that Alberta was getting a raw deal in Confederation compared to Quebec. That was the basis of much of Jason Kenney's campaign in the 2019 election. And shortly after being elected premier, he convened what was called the Fair Deal Panel. Fair Deal Panel was there to consult Albertans and report on ideas that would give Alberta a bigger voice within Confederation and increase provincial powers in areas of provincial jurisdiction. So this panel specifically designed to look at some of these ideas that were originally contained in the firewall letter. And not surprisingly, all of the ideas from the 2000 firewall letter were a part of the Fair Deal Panel's 25 final recommendations. And this included in their recommendations the development of a comprehensive plan to create an Alberta Pension Plan and withdraw from the Canada Pension Plan, and then place it before Albertans in a referendum. Kenney accepted all of the panel's recommendations and in fall of 2020 contracted LifeWorks to study the feasibility, pros and cons of opting out of the CPP. The mandate letter given to LifeWorks was to develop a detailed analysis of the costs, benefits, and structure of a potential Alberta plan. This analysis shall include actuarial, economic, legal, and technical information regarding the establishment and ongoing operation of an APP. This analysis will give all of us a clearer picture on what a future provincial pension plan may look like and help answer key questions that Albertans are asking about the costs and benefits of such a move. The report was actually produced and finalized in 2021, but the government did not release it. By this time, Kenney himself was in some trouble politically. So it was just not released and kept within government circles. During the provincial election last spring, Danielle Smith didn't talk about plans for the EPP, refused to talk about it, but she did say that the report was being updated and would be released when it was ready, at which time it would be put to Albertans for feedback and vote. So as we know now, the report was released last month, and it begins actually with providing some good background on the CPP, some of which I just went over, and make some uncontroversial assertions to start. So, for example, it asserts that Alberta has the right to pull out of the CPP and set up its own pension plan, as long as it delivers benefits that are equal or better than those offered by the CPP and that are portable across the country. And it also asserts, which is indisputable, that were Alberta to leave, it would be entitled to some portion of the over $500 billion in assets currently held by the CPP. The tricky part, and where this report gets in trouble, is trying to figure out how much of this $500 billion Alberta would be entitled to take with it. As I mentioned earlier, when the CPP Act was written and passed in '65, it included a formula for a province to leave and take its rightful share of the assets. The problem with that is that although the structure of the plan has changed significantly since 1965, the formula has not. It hasn't been amended. It's remained exactly the same. And the bottom line is that it's a formula that is unworkable because it was a formula devised when the plan looked very differently. The formula, as it's currently written, would result in Alberta being entitled to over 100% of the fund's assets upon leaving, 117% to be precise. And if all provinces were to leave, based on this formula, we would have to allocate over 900% That's 9 times what is currently available in the CPP fund. So the formula is completely unworkable and cannot be used to calculate how much money the province leaving could take with it. So the report's author, interesting side note, we don't know who the report's actual author was because for some reason they've requested to have their name redacted from the report. I don't know if that says anything about what's in the report, but we don't know who the actual author is. Regardless, the author acknowledges that this would be ridiculous and unworkable. So instead of doing what most researchers would do in these scenarios and present a range of options for how funds might be allocated, the authors choose to focus on only one alternative formula, an alternative formula that they actually invent. It's based on their what they consider to be a fair interpretation of the language or the intent of the act when it was written in 1965. This invented formula yields a number of $334 billion as the amount that Alberta would be entitled to take with it should it choose to leave the CPP. That number, $334 billion, represents over half of the CPP's assets, 53%. To be exact, which in my mind anyways, is just as ridiculous and unworkable as what the original 1956 formula would yield. Extrapolating from that, using the report's formula, just Ontario and Alberta combined would use up over 100% of the CPP's assets were they both to leave. Looking at that number in a different way, Alberta's net contributions to the CPP's current asset base has been around 16% of the total. So to somehow imagine that we can leverage that 16% net contribution to justify walking away with over half of the plan's assets is just an absolute and complete fantasy. Regardless, the authors double down and insist that this $334 billion number is reasonable, and they go on to premise every other finding in the report on that number. And the government, of course, has taken that fantasy number as gospel truth and have based their entire case for the Alberta Pension Plan on it. So I'm going to go over the government's claims really quickly here because, as I say above, they really have no merit in fact, right? They're just out there circulating as these claims that they want to base their arguments on, but they're not grounded in anything. These include that Alberta workers would save $1,425 per year on their contributions, that the plan itself would have $5 billion in savings, which could be used to increase benefits or provide a one-time retirement bonus or reduce contribution rates further, or all three of those things. They claim an APP would have greater stability resulting from the $334 billion asset base for a plan of just 2.4 million workers, and that there would be greater Alberta control over how those funds were invested. In other words, that the government would have the ability to invest those funds to help grow Alberta's economy. Of course, as is often the case with this government's claims, the reality is much different from what they're claiming. And I'll start with this whole question of the asset transfer, which again is the piece that the whole case relies on. And there are two ways of actually coming up with an asset transfer going forward. The first is by actually amending the text of the CPP Act and including a modern formula into it. The challenge with that piece is that amendment of the CPP Act would require the approval of 2/3 of the included provinces, representing 2/3 of the included population. So 6 provinces representing 66% of the population that's in the Canada Pension Act, a vote that would not likely go Alberta's way because they're unlikely to find 2/3 of the province to say, no, take more than 50% of the fund for sure. We'll make do with the rest. The other way of coming at this would be to request an interpretation of the language in the Act. In other words, to say, try and decipher what was actually meant, what the intention was when they did this, and then create a formula according to that. This interpretation would be initially determined by the federal government to move forward, but would almost inevitably end up in the Supreme Court to determine what the act actually says and what a formula would be. Either way, the bottom line is that Alberta will not get to unilaterally determine what the base asset transfer would be if they walked away from the plan. And the likelihood of it being 334 billion or anything close to it is exactly zero. So once you get rid of that number, the whole premise that the Alberta government is selling this act based upon just disappears. University of Calgary economist Trevor Tombe has produced a super thorough and meticulously researched report that provides a much more realistic set of calculations and possibilities. His finding is that Alberta would likely be entitled to somewhere between its 16% contribution and an absolute top end of 25% of the CPP's asset base. Says the most likely figure would be in the range of about 20%, or approximately 125 billion. With that amount of transfer, he suggests that pension contributions by Albertans would at most drop by 1%, which would be about $37 a year that he suggests Albertans would save at best, but likely less than that once you factor in demographic risks, political risks, and investment risks. Benefit payments would remain the same as those from the CPP, and the likelihood of any type of retirement bonus is simply not possible with the reduced asset base. Those are kind of the realities that Trevor Tombe calculates. And if you're a math whiz, if you're a math person, it's actually interesting reading and fairly compelling stuff, the way he calculates these numbers. The other aspect of this is that we would, of course, also impact the CPP's current actuarial soundness, likely resulting in increased contribution rates for other Canadians that stay in the plan were we to leave and take a good chunk of the asset base with us. So contrary to the government's fantasy, Tombe's findings show that leaving the plan would result in minimal reductions in contribution rates, if any, no improvements in benefit rates, and significantly increased risk. And we'd also seriously tick off the rest of the country. But I imagine for this government, that would be considered a benefit and not a negative to find a way to tick off everybody else in the country. So given that the numbers aren't there, I want to talk a little bit about the rhetoric, because as increasingly seems to be the case with politics in Alberta these days, much of what passes for debate on issues is actually just overblown rhetoric that's not grounded in facts. And I want to focus on just a few examples, and we can bring more up in the Q&A and discussion afterwards. The first one is that Albertans pay into CPP disproportionately, that we contribute more than we get out of it, which is not the case at all. Albertans pay into and benefit from CPP on the exact same basis as every other worker in Canada. Nobody is subsidizing anybody, and there's no raw deal for Alberta in the CPP today. We all pay the same way, we all benefit the same way, regardless of where we are and where we retire. Second piece of rhetoric, and this one is right on the government's website, that Alberta has paid 60 billion more into the CPP since its inception than it has received from the CPP. Again, this is just not true. Alberta actually does not pay into the CPP. Alberta as a government, Alberta as an entity does not pay into the CPP. Alberta workers pay into the CPP, not the government. This is not a provincial fairness issue and should not be framed that way. And while it is true that contributions coming from Alberta workers today are greater than what is being paid to retirees in Alberta today, that fact is useless. Every worker in Alberta that is paying into CPP will at some point draw benefits from the CPP, regardless of whether they choose to retire in Alberta or anywhere else in the country, which, as we know, many Albertans do choose to retire other places in the country. This one is a little more grounded in fact. Alberta has a younger workforce, so our contribution would be lower if we had our own plan. Actuarial analysis of pension plan sustainability is not based on current demographics, but on future demographics. You have to look forward to figure out what's going to happen with retirement rates and with number of workers. And while it may be true that having more people paying into the plan than drawing from it is helpful to plan sustainability, there are two key factors to consider in that. First of all, is that every one of these young workers paying in today will draw benefits at some point in the future. So if more young workers today actually means more retirees tomorrow. So it all balances out. There is no net gain there. And this is one part that gets really confusing in CPP calculations today because CPP doesn't aggregate this by province. We have to pay those benefits out wherever those people choose to retire. How many Albertans do you know that have retired in BC or have gone back home to Atlantic Canada or Ontario on retirement? Just because fewer people retire in Alberta doesn't necessarily mean that we will pay out less retirement benefits going forward. So that's not a slam dunk that our contribution rates would be less. And then the one that's really concerning, and I think is the one that's at the heart of this, it was at the heart of the firewall letter in 2001 and Kenny's campaign promises, is that having our own pension plan would enable us to invest those dollars in Alberta industry and provide jobs for Albertans. Bottom line here, folks, is that giving any government political control over how pension dollars are invested is a patently risky and, dare I say, stupid move under any circumstances. The CPP Investment Board operates entirely separate from government and makes its own investment decisions. An Alberta Pension Plan would be likely to end up in the hands of AIMCO, which on the other hand exists under ministerial control, and as such, the possibility and temptation would be tremendous of government direction and interference in its mandate and priorities. We saw this a few years ago when the provincial government introduced what they called the Alberta Growth Mandate, which was a policy by which the government instructed AIMCO to allocate a portion of its investments to Alberta oil and gas startups. The result, as you can imagine, was a series of investments to small Alberta companies that were in trouble already and went bankrupt pretty quickly after we invested in them, losing millions of dollars from our provincial investment fund. It's also worth noting that AIMCO's investment returns have historically been much worse than the CPPIB, including operating at a $2 billion annual loss a couple of years ago because of failed new investment strategy. So just to kind of wrap up this portion of it, you know, what's clear is that the government's whole report, their engagement strategy around it, is really a sham. The findings are entirely manufactured. There's no room for actual discussion based on facts because they're not acknowledging the facts of what this could or might look like. And the campaign is based on a flawed rhetorical premise. The engagement survey and the telephone town halls are designed, take a close look, I encourage you to, around selling you a false bill of goods. And they're not about really any kind of informed grown-up discussion or dialogue about the pension plan. Ultimately, what we're talking about is Danielle Smith trying to pay back the report she received from the radical right of the UCP in her leadership bid and the provincial election, and improving her political fortunes as many, many premiers before her have done by launching just one more battle against Ottawa and our federal institutions. Hopefully, folks, this time it doesn't work because this time what they're playing with in this battle is our retirement security. And that would not be a good thing for any of us. So I think I'll stop there and hoping and happy to open it up to some questions and discussions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ricardo, for this talk. So much is there, and there's probably a ton of questions people want to ask. I know I do. I just want to open up the floor, and people, if you would like to submit any written questions, the link to the form for written questions is in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and we will get to some of those questions from the floor as well. When you were unmuted, just give your name and the question about pensions to Ricardo, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But before we open up the floor to questions, I'd like to ask Lisa if any written submissions have come in that we could address to Ricardo.
Yep, we have one, Quinn. It's from Joy. How is it that Alberta would have a claim for 16% of net contributions, given that our population is about 8% of the total in Canada?
Thanks, Joy. That's actually a good question, and that speaks to this idea that we have more contributors per capita than other provinces do because of our younger workforce. And we have fewer retirees. So when you calculate that net, you take a look at the number of contributions, the size of the contributions, and because Alberta tends to have a higher income base, we have more people contributing at the maximum. So we have more people contributing, and we have more people contributing at the highest level. And when you factor out the net, we have fewer people drawing or as a negative from those contributions. So we do wind up having contributed a larger proportion to the asset base than the population that we account for.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was wondering that too, and I couldn't make sense of the numbers there. I would like to say, if anybody does want to ask a question from the floor, please feel free to raise your hand now or submit written questions online. And that link again is in the chat. Not seeing any. So I think, Rick, what I would like to do is just ask you, you did touch on this, but I want to know, I hear a lot of rhetoric about comparing a potential Alberta pension plan to a Quebec pension plan that currently exists. And you did touch on this, but I'm wondering if you could give a really basic summary of, if we were to undertake this transition to Alberta pension plan, and what kind of comparison are we looking at? Like, is the Quebec pension plan a good comparator for what we would be expecting, and what would be the net result of that?
Sure. As I mentioned during the talk, Quebec didn't join the CPP because they had, like Alberta does now, a younger population and more workers than retirees. So they thought that they would get, because of those demographics, a better deal. They would be able to reduce contributions from what was being calculated for the CPP. Quebec was also, much like Alberta, is very interested in exercising some control over investments in a fund. They wanted to engage in some province building at the time in the 50s. They wanted to build out the economy and build out some francophone institutions and programming in Quebec, and they thought this would be a good use of the funds. So the Quebec pension plan is stable, so it worked and it's comparable. The benefits provided are the same as the Canada Pension Plan. What changed, as I also mentioned in the presentation, was the demographics. Although Quebec had a younger demographic in 1956, more workers and retirees, that's not the case anymore. Quebec's demographics shifted to the extent that now the premiums paid by workers in Quebec, the contributions made by workers in Quebec to the Quebec pension plan are higher than those paid within the CPP. So I think that really kind of highlights that risk of the demographics, and that just because we have a larger number of workers today than we have retirees doesn't mean that we can all of a sudden just reduce our contributions and be fine going forward. At some point, the risk of those demographics changing is high. We know that when the Alberta economy crashes, as it often does, we get a net outflow of Albertans to other provinces. Just that demographic shift alone would be enough to put our future contribution levels at risk.
Thanks, Ricardo. Lisa, do we have another question from the written submissions?
We do. It's from Ashley. What legislative steps can we expect to see next from the UCP? And what is the most effective way for us to make our voices heard in objection?
Thanks. Those are good questions. So the UCP has committed consistently to putting this to a referendum, right? To a vote by all Albertans. Their current consultation is happening, and the committee is reporting back in May of 2024, so next May. They have an active survey It's a horrible survey by any standards, particularly those of you in the room who might have done some work on scientific surveying or statistics will understand how bad it is. But it's even worse because it's meant to only ask questions about what you want an Alberta pension plan to look like. It doesn't ask whether or not you want an Alberta pension plan. So I would suggest a few things. As Quinn mentioned at the beginning, there are a number of campaigns going on right now, providing information and requesting signatures from people in support of staying in the CPP. One of those is by the Alberta Federation of Labor. One of those is by Public Interest Alberta. So people who want to have their say can sign on to those and have them submitted. Both the AFL and Public Interest Alberta have some very good documents on their site as well that I recommend you read, some good reporting on how this works and what it means for people who want to get really informed on this. And I would also suggest trying to participate in some other way in the engagement sessions that are going on. This is currently being done by telephone town hall. You have to register in hopes of being called on the night that these town halls are happening. The Edmonton one is on November 16th, the evening of November 16th. You can go to the Alberta government website for this, which is albertapensionplan.ca. Click on the Have Your Say button and walk through the steps to register for the town hall and just reassert the concerns and the risks over and over again. We know from a number of previous case studies that when this provincial government, pretty much any provincial government, but this provincial government in particular, sets its mind to convincing Albertans of something and does it under the guise of consultation, they can be very successful in how they do that. They can move public opinion. We saw it. One of the clearest examples that comes to my mind was in 2002, when Canada was on the verge of signing on to the Kyoto Accord. Repeated surveying showed that over 70% of Albertans supported the Kyoto Accord and wanted to sign on as a country for climate action and some kind of climate work. They wanted to move with the rest of the country. Ralph Klein at the time, as premier, launched a tremendous rhetorical campaign, guised as consultation, to convince Albertans of a Made in Alberta climate plan that really wouldn't have any action at all. And within 9 months of launching that campaign, the popular opinion in Alberta had flipped from 72% in favor of Kyoto to 75% opposed to Kyoto and in favor of a Made in Alberta plan. So we know the government can be compelling. They've got tremendous influence on the means of communication that Albertans receive. And the frame of this is about fairness, this is about bringing our pension dollars back to Alberta, is one that's very compelling to Albertans. So participate in those sessions, get heard, write letters to the editor, contact your MLAs, just all the usual stuff, but actually do it and be heard. The more people hear that their popular opinion is not shifting on this, and it hasn't shifted so far, the more likely they are to back off of this.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I also just want to mention we also once again put in the links for Public Interest Alberta and the Alberta Federation of Labor actions. There's letter writing campaigns and ways to contact government officials. And we also put a link into the Alberta Pension Plan survey, some of the pieces they put out if you want to try to take a stab at that. Although I have to say it's a pretty loaded survey, as Ricardo alluded to. And I just wanted, actually, no, you know what? We'll go straight to a question. Fathia, you have a question?
Thank you, Quinn. No, actually, I just want to make a comment and reiterate what Ricardo said. So as a union, it is the new exercise or I don't know, hockey game these days to have anti-politics, everywhere and blaming the governments. However, we have to understand that the government is the one institution that the people can have and can have an effect by participating, like Ricardo said, So if we want institutional change, we need to participate. The government has a defect, meaning it's democratic. Corporations are not democratic, and we can't change that. So by privatizing the CPP or the healthcare or the electricity, just know your maneuver. We can, if we vote, if we participate, if as a union, as a citizen, we have our say, we can actually make institutional changes. But if there's a corporation in place, it's going to be another game ball. Thank you.
I would just add, Quinn, on the government survey. Again, there's no really question that asks how you feel about an APP. So what I did when I filled it out, and what other folks are doing, is wherever you get a chance to comment, just comment that the way to solve this question, or your preference for this question, is that it stay under the CPP, and just repeat that in the comments. That's the only space you have to say it. So if you're not in favor of leaving the CPP, that's the only avenue you have to do it, is through those comment boxes on the Alberta government survey.
Yeah, thanks, Rick, and thanks, Fatih, as well. Yeah, both good points. And when I was trying to do the survey, it was quite frustrating, because they don't actually ever ask such a direct question about, would you like to leave the CCP, or do you think it's a good idea, or do you think it's a better idea to, like, it's a very directed kind of survey. So folks, take it for what it's worth, and do what you can with it. Yeah, and I just want to say that Fathia is correct. We all need to kind of pull together to protect our retirement savings as best we can. I know the Alberta government spent a little over $10 million. Rick, I don't know if you know what the actual numbers are at this point, but they have a very expensive and possibly effective campaign undergoing right now that is trying to change public opinion in Alberta. I guess I do have another question, and this is kind of related to what Ashley had asked before, but the potential for this to go through the courts and to be litigated to death, and for a very long time, it seems like it's inevitable, were it Alberta to have a referendum that passed the idea from the electorate. And do you have any sense about how long something like that would take, just to kind of throw that idea out there to the membership? Like, how long would this remain in the Supreme Court, and how much do you think other provinces would battle this?
Yeah, so the starting point is that any government, any province wishing to leave the CPP has to provide 3 years notice. So that's the minimum it would take. Upon provision of that notice is when the arguments over the formula would start. And of course, these things don't go to the courts immediately. The first step at that point would likely be, as I said, there could be a motion to amend the act and rewrite the formula, which would be difficult. Again, to get 2/3 of provinces with 2/3 of the population agreeing on anything is not likely. And then it would go to the federal government to actually say, this is how we interpret this clause and the intention of it. So this would be the amount that Alberta can take with it, at which point Alberta would likely object and start the process in the courts to do that. And it wouldn't be as quick necessarily as the reference case that we just heard back on the Impact Assessment Act was, because that was just a reference case. That wasn't actually a case that worked its way up through the courts for an actual Supreme Court decision. And this would have to, because the Supreme Court would have to be the ones to actually interpret what the act said. So that would be a longer process, anywhere from 2 years upward. So we're looking at none of this actually moving forward in any significant way. I'd say for at least 5 years before it's all wrapped up, because then once all that's settled, once we know the amount, The Alberta government needs to set up the institutions, needs to set up the plans, needs to set up the administration of it, needs to set up the investment supervision of it, like needs to set up all of those things, which again is not a quick process. So, you know, we will not have, even if everything goes perfectly smoothly, we will not have an Alberta pension plan before 5 years from now.
That's a good point. And then I just really quickly, is there any administration costs that have been estimated for administering a separate plan for Alberta? Do you?
Well, so Trevor Toome talks about this and its impact on the costs. I mean, we're paying a portion of the administrative plan right now for the CPP, so those are comparable. And this is the one place where the provincial government is actually willing to acknowledge options and willing to suggest that, you know, an APP could be administered by the CPP Investment Board and could be managed by the CPP and the CRA, meaning we would just continue to pay approximately what we pay now for them to administer the plan on our behalf. It would likely be more because it would be a different type of administration. So the costs potentially are anywhere from what we're paying now to, you know, a few extra $1 million per year to set up an administration board, an investment board, governance, administrative infrastructure, all of those things so that we can do it ourselves. Or a third option is has come up is to just contract this out to the private sector. Find some private sector company to administer the plan on our behalf, which is a preferred option of many of the right-wing commentators who have talked about this Alberta pension plan possibility in the past, is have the private sector administer it.
Which presents a whole suite of other problems. But on that note, I think I should go to Lisa. She has another written submission she would like to ask.
Yeah, question from Joy. So does this mean that we should also ensure that federally the Conservatives do not form government?
I mean, I think it would certainly expedite things for the Alberta government if the Conservatives were the federal government. But it's important to note that when it comes to CPP, the federal government is not the only stakeholder, right? All of the provinces and territories are stakeholders as well. So they all get a say in this. They all participate in decision-making around this. And it's not just up to the feds to say, oh yeah, no, we like Alberta's suggestion, so let's go with it. Also, I think even a Conservative federal government would not be likely to agree with the calculations done in the Alberta report, because pretty much it would gut the CPP. And I can't imagine even a Conservative government wanting to be the ones to take responsibility for killing one of the most successful public pension plans on the planet.
Probably not a wise political move.
Yeah.
That's an understatement. I just want to put out one more call up for questions from the floor, either written submissions or if you would like to raise your hand to ask a question, please do so now. But I'm not seeing any others. So going once, going twice. First of all, I just want to thank some of our friends from the McEwen Staff Association, Mount Royal Staff Association, and ASHWA for all making an appearance today and listening to Ricardo speak and informing us all a little bit more about the proposed Alberta Pension Plan. We're happy to take written questions anytime. I'm happy to take emails and but for now, we'll just say thank you, Ricardo, for coming out and delivering this message to us. And also, that being said, I just want to do a few more housekeeping items. Please, if you have concerns about the Alberta Pension Plan, we'll drop some links for the Alberta Federation of Labour and Public Interest Alberta campaigns that are ongoing right now, where you can lend your support. And a reminder, Friends of Medicare discussion on pharmacare is happening next Tuesday, noon to 1, Students' Union Building, but it's hybrid, so please come either way. And don't forget Parkland's 27th annual conference coming up from November 17th to 19th. That link will also be dropped into the chat box. So if you can make it, I'd love to see you there as well. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all around campus.
Thanks, Quinn. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ricardo.